Yes, looks a many-backed beast. That's in the club's hall, let's love.
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the biggest freak of all?
This is a scene from George's hit musical Taboo. Backstage, I first asked him how everyone got on now and if there were still tensions within the band.
The thing about Culture Club is that it's one of those things whenever I do a tour with them, particularly the last tour where we went to kind of Asia and, you know, sort of America, and it was quite a long haul. At the end of it, I was like, never again. And I think we sort of had that really, we never really kind of officially split up, we kind of just drifted away. You know, sort of bands like the Wham or the Jam. In fact, it rhymes, it's fantastic. Wham or the Jam, thank you ma'am. You know, they sort of officially split up, whereas we kind of just drifted apart, which sort of always left the door open for us to kind of come back and do things together. And in a kind of sort of weird way, I feel that, you know, although I can do stuff on my own now, and there's a lot more freedom in being a solo artist, and I can get away with more, I can be more outrageous, I can be more provocative, I can be more outspoken about my sexuality. Obviously, if you're in a band, you are slightly restricted by two heterosexuals and one inverted commas. But I do feel a kind of sort of loyalty towards the band, because I do feel that without them and without the experiences that I had with them, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. You know, if you work with people and you've kind of, you know, when you're in a band, you kind of grow up in public, you know, you grow up in front of people. So there is a kind of loyalty and there is a kind of mutual respect. And yes, you hate each other and you love each other. And it's kind of, how would I describe it best? I think it's a bit like going home for Christmas to the family. You know, the arguments about what you're going to watch, Hot the Pops or the Queen's Speech. I always go for the Queen's Speech myself. You know, so I mean, you know, I just feel that, you know, it's nice to sort of have a break from it and come back to it.
So how difficult is it to keep a profile in today's music business as opposed to past decades?
I think a lot of it is, well, I think that, you know, one of the wonderful things about sort of early 80s kind of music, and I think the 70s particularly was great because it was such an eclectic time for music. You had kind of sort of the dinosaur rock bands, then you had kind of punk hijacking that, then you had kind of Michael Jackson in front of a lyrics curtain singing Rock With You, then you had disco, and you had like the Sex Pistols and the Good Bay Dance Band, and you had reggae. It was just such a mad time for music, and I think that's kind of influenced what I do. And it's also hindered what I do as a musician, because I think that people don't really know where to put me. So are you a DJ? Are you a hippie? Or are you a dance artist? Or what are you? And I just, you know, I mean, if I go back to when I was sort of buying Bowie albums when I was 13, you know, every time Bowie released an album, I would be sort of horrified. You know, when I bought Station to Station or Diamond Dogs, I'd think, oh, what's he doing? You know, what's he doing? And then within a week, it would be my favourite record. And I think that kind of whole idea of kind of respecting people for challenging themselves musically, for taking risks with their careers, is no longer respected. And I think you're required in this day and age to kind of keep almost repeating yourself. And I think it's one of the only art forms. I mean, you know, sculptors have a style or painters have a style, but you don't do the same painting every time you do a painting or a sculpture. Henry Moore might have a style, but, you know, it's kind of expanded on. Whereas I think what's happened to pop music is it's almost become so formulaic and so sort of almost like it's the sort of cultural equivalent of sort of beef, sort of pre-packed. So you don't sort of have to think about this poor grass-eating animal, vegetarian animal that you're actually stuffing in your face. I think that's a good answer. I'm pleased with that.
So what do you put the success of Culture Club down to?
I think it's all about timing. You know, I mean, a lot of people have asked me in the last kind of few, 10 years, whether, and especially a lot recently, whether I think I would have been, or the band would have been successful had we started now. And maybe not, maybe people wouldn't be ready for that, And I also think that ideas now, because of the information age, are kind of consumed at an alarming rate. So anything that sort of new happens gets swallowed almost immediately. So imagine if punk happened now, it would be in a B&Q advert within 2 weeks. So it kind of takes away the kind of impetus and the kind of power of that music, which is kind of what happened to drum and bass or jungle, whatever you want to call it, and to a lot of dance music. And I think that we had that luxury of being able to be a kind of, sort of best kept secret. I mean, we used to set up our own gigs, you know, a long time, you know, before we got signed, we were actually sort of going around the country. I remember going to sort of, you know, Birmingham in a black taxi cab that John had borrowed from a friend with, like, you know, all the equipment for the show, and doing a sort of a gig at, it was a famous footballer, I can't remember his name now, he played for some group, some football club in Birmingham, but it was this club called the Holy City Zoo, and we sort of did a gig there, and then we sort of packed it up afterwards. And, you know, and in those days you'd get heckled all the time, you know, you'd be constantly kind of, you know, fighting off the crowd, they'd be shouting names at you, faggot and puff, you know, things that you don't know you are. It's been a surprise to me.
As a teenager, how prepared for success were you, and what was your family life like?
I think I was brought up with a very strong work ethic. You know, when I lived at home, we were never allowed to sign on the dole. That was absolutely forbidden. So if you took a job, which I had a lot of jobs, you know, I worked in a fruit factory, you know, or hat shop. I never lasted very long in any job because I always had a problem with authority. So if I did walk out of a job, the next morning I would be front marched, literally, to the job office. It was a case of, if you're going to live in this house, you will work and you will pay, you know, your way. I mean, you always kind of borrowed the money back off your mother, you know, when you're out to the discotheque, but it was just the idea that you worked, and I think that's probably where that comes from.
Now, what were the main influences that made you want to sing and perform?
Well, I think a lot of it really comes from childhood, you know, sort of growing up in a sort of suburban place where you felt that you weren't part of the kind of mainstream, you know, sort of kids have this kind of unnerving ability to kind of poke you where it hurts. Do you know you look like Brian Ferry? Anyway, a little bit, you've got a bit of a Brian Ferry look about you. But I think what it is that when you're at school and you're sort of 6 years old and I was very effeminate as a kid. I had very long, you know, I had long hair, and a lot of people used to think I was a girl. So I'd be out shopping with my mother, and people say, "Oh, what's your daughter's name?" And I sort of got that all from my childhood, and then I discovered David Bowie, and that sort of was really the beginning of my kind of, oh my God, I'm not alone. You know, there's other people out there. Actually, I think it started before that with Quentin Crisp, seeing The Negative Was Serving, because it was like, my God, there was somebody like that in the 1930s. That was really just like, I can remember sort of watching that on TV in my parents' house, and slowly everyone in the family kind of leaving the room, you know, and just sort of lying on the floor and just being in absolute ecstasy about this film, and thinking, well, this is fantastic. And so, you know, and then sort of finding out about people like Oscar Wilde or, you know, Cecil Beaton, and just all those things. I think there's this kind of fantastic kind of daisy chain of people that have kind of, in their own way, made it possible for me to be who I am. But I don't necessarily think that it changes society, because I think that what happens is that you kind of slightly live in a cultural bubble. I don't think my cultural bubble is quite as big as Elton John's, but it's big enough for me to kind of avoid, you know, sort of, you know, living in fear or being chased down the street. And I'm quite tough, you know, I can look after myself. I mean, I'm constantly getting into arguments with people, and I think what's funny about that is that people kind of, because if they see you dressed up and you're sort of in makeup, they're sort of rude to you, they're so shocked that you react in such an aggressive way that they kind of don't quite know what to do. And that was always true of Lee, because I mean, Lee was 6'2", and probably 3 times my size in weight, and with sort of platforms and various headdresses, it was quite a sort of formidable thing to be encountered by. And, you know, I'd often be in the street with Lee, and people would kind of gangs of kids would come towards you, and they actually didn't know what to do, because it was like, well, what is it? And I think when you can't put a label on something, it's more terrifying. And that's why I loved Lee Barry, because you couldn't kind of actually say, well, you're a punk rocker, or you're a new romantic, or how can you say that to someone with a toilet on their head? It's like, or, you know, just like an emu, or covered in spawns. I really should have a thermometer in my mouth right now, but there you go.